Right now, somewhere in the world, a doctor is prescribing a 2-week course of antibiotics for a stomach ulcer. The patient will take the pills, the bacteria will die, and the ulcer will heal. Permanently. This has been standard medical practice since the mid-1990s. Hundreds of millions of people have been cured by it. Ask anyone who made that possible. They'll tell you Barry Marshall. Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, who won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2005 for discovering that stomach ulcers are caused by a bacterium called Helicobacter pylori. They're not wrong, but they're not entirely right either. There was a man who knew this first. A Greek physician named John Lycoudes, who figured it out in 1958, 25 years before Marshall published anything, cured thousands of patients with it, tried to tell the world, and was fined by his own medical board for the trouble. He died in 1980. Barry Marshall announced his findings in 1983. The margin between Lycoudes and vindication was less than 3 years. He never saw it. This is his story. John Lycoudes was born in 1910 in Missolonghi, a small city on the western coast of Greece, a place with its own complicated relationship with being forgotten. Missolonghi is where Lord Byron died in 1824, trying to help liberate Greece from Ottoman rule. It is a city that knows something about noble causes abandoned too soon. Lycoudes trained as a physician and spent his career as a general practitioner in the same region where he was born. He was not a researcher at a prestigious university. He had no laboratory budget, no graduate students, no institutional prestige behind his name. He was a village doctor, in the most honorable sense of that phrase, the kind of doctor who knew his patients by name, who had treated families across generations, who measured his success in people who got well. In the mid-20th century, that relative obscurity would cost him everything, because what Lycoudes discovered was not a minor refinement. It was a complete overturning of one of medicine's most entrenched certainties, and the medical establishment does not respond kindly when a provincial GP in rural Greece tells it that everything it knows is wrong. To understand what Lycoudes was up against, you have to understand the doctrine he was challenging. By 1958, the cause of peptic ulcers had been considered settled science for over a century. The accepted explanation was psychosomatic and chemical: stress, excess stomach acid, spicy food, alcohol, personality type. Ulcers were what happened to anxious, hard-driving people who ate badly and worried too much. The stomach, it was believed, was simply too acidic an environment for any bacterium to survive. This was not fringe thinking. This was consensus, taught in every medical school, printed in every textbook, defended by every major gastroenterological body in the world. The idea that a bacterium could live in gastric acid was considered, by most experts, to be self-evidently impossible. Then, in 1958, John Lycoudes got a stomach ulcer. He was 48 years old and he treated himself. He prescribed himself an antibiotic compound, one that included streptomycin and other agents, and the ulcer resolved. Completely. That by itself might have been dismissed as coincidence, a spontaneous remission that happened to coincide with the treatment. Lycoudes did not dismiss it. He was a physician. He paid attention. He began prescribing the same approach to his ulcer patients, and he watched what happened. They got better. Not temporarily. Not in the way that antacids suppress symptoms for a while before the pain returned. They got better and stayed better. Lycoudes refined his formula over the following years into a preparation he called Elgaco. It contained antibiotics, and it worked with a consistency that, to any open-minded observer, should have demanded an explanation. Lycoudes understood what the explanation was. He theorized, correctly, as we now know, that stomach ulcers were caused by a bacterial infection, that the bacterium responsible was capable of surviving in the gastric environment, that treating the infection with antibiotics would eliminate the ulcer at its source, not merely manage its symptoms. He was right on every significant point, and he knew he was right because he could see it in his patients. Over the course of the 1960s and 1970s, he treated, by his own records, somewhere in the range of 4,000 patients with this method. The outcomes were documented. The results were reproducible. This was not anecdote. This was evidence. He wanted to tell the world. In 1961, Lycoudes submitted a paper to the Journal of the American Medical Association. JAMA was, and remains, one of the most influential medical publications on Earth. A paper accepted there would have reached every major physician and researcher in the Western world. JAMA rejected it. The grounds were not that his evidence was fabricated or his data fraudulent. The grounds were, essentially, that his conclusion was impossible. That bacteria could not survive in stomach acid, that his premise violated established science. The rejection was not an engagement with his evidence, it was a dismissal of his framework. He tried again. Through the 1960s, Lykoudis sought to publish his findings in multiple journals. He presented his work to Greek medical bodies. He wrote about it. He advocated for it with a persistence that, given the resistance he faced, required considerable courage. The response from the medical establishment was not curiosity. It was not skepticism in the productive scientific sense, the kind that demands more data and then follows the data wherever it leads. The response was hostility. In 1966, the Medical Association of Patras, the regional body with authority over Lykoudis' practice, fined him. The fine was for prescribing an unorthodox treatment, in other words, for prescribing antibiotics for ulcers, for doing the thing that would, 30 years later, become the global standard of care. He was not fined for harming patients. His patients were getting well. He was fined for being right in a way that the institution around him was not yet capable of recognizing. There were also reports of a threat of criminal prosecution. The details of how far that threat progressed are not fully documented, but its existence tells you everything you need to know about the temperature of the room. This was not a system asking questions. This was a system defending itself. Lykoudis kept practicing. He kept treating patients. He published, in 1960, a paper in a Greek medical journal describing his antibiotic treatment for what he understood to be a microbial condition. He self-published a pamphlet. He continued to document his results. He did not stop. But the audience he needed, the research community with the laboratory resources and institutional authority to validate his work, to isolate the bacterium, to build the evidentiary case that would force a reckoning, that audience never came. Why not? This is the question that should sit in your chest for a moment, because the answer is not simple and it is not comfortable. Part of the answer is geography and prestige. Lykoudis was a general practitioner in provincial Greece. The research centers that drove gastroenterology in the mid-20th century were in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Western Europe's major academic institutions. A finding from a rural Greek GP carried, in those corridors, a fraction of the weight it would have carried coming from a professor at Johns Hopkins or University College London. This is not a conspiracy. It is a structural bias, the way credibility accretes around institutional prestige and then becomes self-reinforcing. Lykoudis did not have the letterhead. He did not have the lab. He had results, and results, it turned out, were not enough. Part of the answer is also economic. By the 1960s and 1970s, the treatment of peptic ulcers had become a substantial industry. Antacid medications, lifestyle management programs, surgical interventions for severe cases, these represented enormous revenue streams and established professional identities. The idea that all of it could be replaced by a 2-week antibiotic course was not merely scientifically disruptive, it was financially threatening. This is not to say that individual physicians consciously suppressed Lykoudis' work to protect their income. But institutions have interests, and those interests shape what questions get funded, what papers get published, what ideas get taken seriously. The infrastructure around ulcer treatment had no incentive to discover that it was unnecessary. And part of the answer, perhaps the most honest part, is that the science genuinely seemed impossible to the people evaluating it. The bacterium that causes ulcers, now known as Helicobacter pylori, has a remarkable adaptation. It produces an enzyme called urease, which neutralizes the acid in its immediate environment and allows it to colonize the gastric lining. This mechanism was not known in the 1960s. Without understanding how the bacterium survived, the whole idea appeared to contradict basic microbiology. Lykoudis was right for empirical reasons, his patients got better, but he could not explain the mechanism, and mechanism is what research science runs on. This is the tragedy of his position. He had the truth. He could not yet prove the truth in the language the truth needed to be spoken in. Barry Marshall and Robin Warren began their work in Perth, Australia in the early 1980s. They had something Lycoutes never had: a laboratory, institutional support, and the technological tools to culture the bacterium under controlled conditions. In 1982, Warren successfully isolated what would become known as Helicobacter pylori from a patient's gastric biopsy. In 1983, Marshall presented their findings at a conference in Brussels. In 1984, to silence the skeptics who still insisted no one would deliberately infect themselves with an ulcer-causing bacterium if they truly believed in it, Marshall drank a solution containing H. pylori, developed gastritis, and treated himself with antibiotics. The medical world, slowly and then all at once, accepted the evidence. In 2005, Marshall and Warren received the Nobel Prize. They deserve credit for what they did. Warren's isolation of the bacterium was a genuine scientific achievement. Marshall's willingness to stake his own body on his conviction was, by any measure, extraordinary. Their perseverance in the face of institutional resistance, and there was resistance, even in the 1980s, was real. This is not about diminishing what they accomplished. But Marshall himself, it should be noted, eventually acknowledged Lycoutes. In the years following his Nobel Prize, Marshall stated publicly that Lycoutes had been the first physician to successfully treat ulcers with antibiotics, that he had been right, and that history had treated him badly. That acknowledgement matters. It does not rewrite the Nobel citation, but it is not nothing. John Lycoutes died in 1980 in Missolonghi, the city where he was born and where he had spent his life. He was 70 years old. He had been right for 22 years. He had watched his findings rejected, his methods penalized, his reputation diminished by the very institution he had dedicated his life to serving. He died without vindication, without recognition, without so much as a letter from a journal saying that perhaps they had been too hasty. 3 years later, Barry Marshall presented in Brussels. The timing is almost too cruel to sit with. 3 years. Lycoutes did not miss the Nobel Prize by decades, by a generation, by the vast interval of historical distance that makes injustice easier to process. He missed it by 3 years. If he had lived until 1984, he would have read the Marshall and Warren paper. He would have seen the mechanism his intuition had correctly mapped. He might have corresponded with Marshall. He might have been named. He was not given that chance. What remains of John Lycoutes is modest in volume, but clear in its implications. His 1960 paper in the Greek medical journal Practica exists. His Elgako preparation exists in the historical record. His patient outcomes, though not preserved with the methodological rigor of a controlled clinical trial, were documented. In 1998, a paper published in the journal Alimentary Pharmacology and Therapeutics formally examined his case and concluded that Lycoutes had, in fact, been treating ulcers as a bacterial infection successfully for decades before Marshall and Warren. The historical record is not ambiguous about what he did or when he did it. What is ambiguous, what remains genuinely unresolved, is what the right response to that record looks like. The Nobel Committee does not award prizes posthumously to those who were not nominated in their lifetime, and no formal mechanism exists to append Lycoutes' name to the 2005 prize. He will not receive a medal. He will not receive the citation. The lecture halls at the Karolinska will not be renamed in his honor. What he can receive, what he has not yet received widely enough, is simply the truth, told plainly, to enough people that the name John Lycoutes becomes part of the story that gets told when the story of ulcers and antibiotics is told. Not instead of Marshall and Warren, alongside them, in the place where the record actually begins. There are, right now, millions of people alive who are not suffering from stomach ulcers because of a treatment that exists. Most of them have never heard of Barry Marshall. Almost none of them have heard of John Lycoutes. That is perhaps understandable. Medicine is not a system designed to honor its history. It is a system designed to treat patients. And in treating patients, it eventually got to the right answer. But the getting there left a man fined, ignored, and buried in his own lifetime for the crime of being correct. And the next time someone tells you that science is purely self-correcting, that good evidence always rises, it is worth remembering a village doctor in Western Greece, who had the evidence, who had the outcomes, who had the truth, and who died waiting for the world to catch up. Some doors open, just not always in time.